The story of the Gambino crime family begins in the early 1900s with a group of Sicilian mobsters who came from Palermo to New York City, led by a man named Ignazio Lupo. At that time, New York was changing fast. Crowded streets, new immigrants, and endless opportunity. Thousands of Italians arrived with hopes of a better life, but some also brought the dark traditions of the old Sicilian underworld. Among them were the men who would quietly build the foundation of what would one day become America's most powerful and feared crime family. When he and his partner by business and marriage, Giuseppe Morello, were sent to prison for counterfeiting in 1910, Salvatore Toto D'Aquila, one of Lupo's chief captains, took over. D'Aquila was an influential emigrant from Palermo who joined the Lupo gang based in East Harlem. This wasn't just a changing of the guard, it was the birth of something new. D'Aquila had ambition, he had vision, and most importantly, he had the ruthlessness to turn a street gang into an organized empire. D'Aquila, an Italian immigrant from Sicily, established the family in the early 20th century and built its influence through activities like extortion and loan sharking. His leadership was marked by a strategic approach to expanding the family's criminal operations amidst the turbulent organized crime landscape of New York City. The streets of New York in those days were a battleground. Different groups fought for control of neighborhoods, businesses, and rackets. But D'Aquila was different. He didn't just want a piece of the pie. He wanted to own the bakery. The 1920s brought prohibition, and with it, opportunities that men like D'Aquila could only have dreamed of. Suddenly, every American who wanted a drink was a potential customer for illegal bootleggers. The money flowed like the whiskey they smuggled, and the family grew stronger. But in this world, strength made you a target. D'Aquila's dominance was challenged by rival factions, leading to his assassination in 1928. The streets claimed another boss, but the family didn't die with him. Salvatore D'Aquila was murdered in 1928, and control of the family went to Frank Scalise. Scalise only stayed in power for 3 years, but the next crime boss, Vincent Mangano, ruled for 2 decades and helped to better establish the family as one of the biggest criminal organizations in the world. Under Vincent Mangano, the family evolved. This wasn't just about muscle and intimidation anymore. Mangano understood that real power came from organization, from having your fingers in every pie, from making yourself indispensable to both the underworld and the legitimate world. For 20 years, he built connections, established territories, and laid the groundwork for what was to come. But Vincent Mangano had a problem, and that problem had a name: Albert Anastasia. By 1951, Albert Anastasia had taken control, and he was best known for overseeing an organization called Murder Incorporated, which performed hundreds of mob-related assassinations. Anastasia was not only thought to be extremely dangerous, but many of his own people considered him to be insane. Anastasia was a different breed. Where other mobsters killed for business, Anastasia seemed to enjoy it. The boss of what became the Gambino family, and the co-founder of Murder, Inc. Untouchale, Albert Anastasia was one of New York's most feared mobsters before his assassination in 1957. Not only did Albert Anastasia help found the modern American Mafia, he also co-founded and later took charge of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. In short, Albert Anastasia was a killer, and a cold-blooded one at that. The transformation from Mangano to Anastasia wasn't peaceful. On October 25, 1957, several masked gunmen murdered Anastasia in the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. But this was just the culmination of years of tension. However, on April 19, 1951, Mangano suddenly disappeared. On the same day, his brother, Philip, was found dead in a marshland area in Jamaica Bay. He had been shot twice in the face and once in the neck. It is believed that Anastasia ordered the brothers' deaths so that he could take control of the family. For 6 years, Anastasia ruled with an iron fist. He expanded the family's operations, made millions, and terrorized both his enemies and his own men. But in the mob, fear without respect is a dangerous combination. And there were men waiting in the wings who understood this better than Anastasia ever could. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia entered the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. As Anastasia sat in the barber's chair, the three assailants rushed in, shoved the barber out of the way, and started shooting. The wounded Anastasia allegedly lunged at his killers, but only hit their reflections in the wall mirror. Anastasia died at the scene. As Anastasia sat facing the mirror, two masked assassins stormed into the shop and fired 10 shots at the stunned mob boss. Confused and disoriented, he attempted to rush his killers, but ended up charging at their reflections instead. It was almost poetic, a man who lived by violence, dying while fighting shadows. The murder of Albert Anastasia was a watershed moment. Mob boss Albert Anastasia is killed in a New York City barber shop in a murder planned by rival mobster Vito Genovese and Anastasia's underboss, Carlo Gambino. This wasn't just a hit. It was a carefully orchestrated coup that would reshape the New York underworld forever. With Anastasia's death, Carlo Gambino became boss of what was now called the Gambino crime family. Joseph Biondo was appointed underboss. He was, by 1965, replaced by Agnello Della Croce. Carlo Gambino was everything Anastasia wasn't. Where Anastasia was loud, Gambino was quiet. Where Anastasia ruled through fear, Gambino ruled through respect and strategic thinking. Small in stature, with a prominent nose and sporting an almost permanent friendly grin used to disarm detractors, Carlo Gambino was the American Mafia's most powerful and respected don from the late 1950s, until he died peacefully of natural causes in 1976 as the face of organized crime in New York City. Known for his quiet, understated demeanor and razor-sharp criminal savvy, Gambino was a teenage hitman in Sicily, alleged to be made into the Mafia overseas before coming to the United States in 1921 at age 19 and going to work for cousins connected to gangland factions in New York. Under Carlo Gambino, the family entered its golden age. This wasn't just about running numbers or controlling a few neighborhood businesses anymore. Under his guidance, the Gambino syndicate expanded into territories and rackets it hadn't in the past, taking almost complete control of labor unions on the New York and New Jersey waterfront, at JFK Airport, and in the trucking, construction, and garment industries along the entire East Coast. Think about what that meant. Every time a building went up in New York, the Gambinos got paid. Every time cargo moved through JFK Airport, they got a cut. Every piece of clothing that moved through the garment district, they had their hand in it. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were an invisible government, taxing New Yorkers on everything from the shirts on their backs to the roofs over their heads. It acquired behind-the-scenes control of Teamsters Local 282, which controlled access to most building materials in the New York City area and could literally bring most construction jobs in New York City to a halt. Imagine having that kind of power. With a single phone call, Gambino could stop every construction project in New York City. No concrete would pour. No buildings would rise. The city that never sleeps would grind to a halt. The construction industry became the family's gold mine. Castellano's son, Philip, was the president of Scaramix Concrete Corporation, which exercised a near monopoly on Staten Island on construction concrete. Castellano also handled the Gambino interests in the Concrete Club, a club of contractors, selected by the commission to handle contracts between $2 million and $15 million. In return, the contractors gave a 2% kickback of the contract value to the commission. Castellano also supervised Gambino control of Teamsters Union Local Chapter 282, which provided workers to pour concrete at all major building projects in New York and Long Island. This was genius-level crime. They didn't need to rob banks or shake down store owners for protection money. They had figured out how to skim money from every major construction project in the city. Every skyscraper, every housing development, every public works project, they all paid the Gambino tax. But Carlo Gambino's true genius wasn't in what he did. It was in what he didn't do. In 50 years of crime, Gambino served only 22 months in prison, 1937-38. He managed to avoid being linked to any criminal activities and ran the family until 1976 without spending a single day in jail. While other mob bosses made headlines, Gambino made money. While others sought the spotlight, he lived in the shadows. Carlo Gambino battled health problems in his later years, finally succumbing to heart disease on October 15, 1976, at his Long Island waterfront home. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at home of natural causes. He had done what seemed impossible in his line of work. He died of old age, in his own bed, having never spent significant time in prison. But his final decision would shake the family to its core. Before dying, Gambino controversially bypassed his number two in charge, Della Croce, in favor of his brother-in-law Castellano, a more corporate-style good fella, leaving his syndicate on shaky ground in subsequent years. Much controversy surrounds his final family act, when instead of appointing his long-term underboss, Agnello Della Croce, he overlooked him in favor of his cousin Paul Castellano, who had spent no time serving on the streets. A new era for the Gambino crime family would open up in 1976, when the family becomes split after the appointment of Castellano. One man in particular who wasn't happy was a young John Gotti who respected Della Croce. Paul Castellano represented everything the street guys hated. He was a businessman who lived in a mansion on Staten Island that the guys on the street called the White House. He preferred negotiating deals to breaking heads. He was more CEO than Godfather, and that didn't sit well with the old-school gangsters who had earned their stripes on the street. Many members of the organization were not happy with the way Castellano ran the family. They thought he acted too much like a business owner and not enough like a don. The family was splitting into two factions: the white-collar criminals who followed Castellano and the blue-collar thugs who remembered the old ways. Among those blue-collar thugs was a young captain from Queens named John Gotti. John Gotti, born October 27, 1940, South Bronx, New York, U.S., died June 10, 2002. Springfield, Missouri, was an American organized crime boss whose flamboyant lifestyle and frequent public trials made him a prominent figure in the 1980s and 90s. Gotti was the fifth of 13 children born to John and Fanny Gotti, both of whom were children of Italian immigrants. As a teenager, Gotti became a leader of a local gang in the East New York section of Brooklyn, and he became involved with the Gambino crime family, one of New York City's 5 families. After dropping out of high school, he frequently had skirmishes with the law and was arrested, mostly for petty crimes. 9 times between the ages of 18 and 26, Gotti was everything Castellano wasn't. Where Castellano was refined, Gotti was rough. Where Castellano avoided attention, Gotti craved it. While his peers generally avoided attracting attention, especially from the media, Gotti became known as the Dapper Don for his expensive clothes and outspoken personality in front of news cameras. The tension between the two factions grew with each passing year. Castellano had banned drug dealing, threatening death to anyone who violated this rule. But Gotti and his crew were making too much money from narcotics to stop. When Castellano found out, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. After John Gotti was caught dealing in narcotics, which was banned by Castellano under threat of death, it came down to an ultimatum. Without full commission backing, Gotti planned the hit on his boss outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. December 16, 1985. A cold Monday evening in Manhattan. Castellano infuriated upstart capo John Gotti, who orchestrated Castellano's murder in 1985. Paul Castellano and his driver, Tommy Bellotti, pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. They never made it inside. As Castellano stepped out of his Lincoln Town car, 4 men in identical white trench coats and black Russian fur hats appeared from the shadows. In seconds, both Castellano and Bilotti lay dead on the sidewalk, their blood mixing with the dirty Manhattan snow. 2 weeks after the death of Della Croce in 1985, Castellano was murdered following an order by one of his top people, John Gotti. Watching from a car across the street was John Gotti, orchestrating every moment. Gotti, born and educated in New York City, became head of the powerful Gambino family after boss Paul Castellano was murdered outside a steakhouse in Manhattan in December 1985. The gang assassination, the first in 3 decades in New York, was organized by Gotti and his colleague Sammy the Bull Gravano. This wasn't just a murder. It was a declaration. The old ways were dead. The age of the Dapper Don had begun. Gotti took over control of the Gambino crime family with his second-in-command, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Unlike his predecessors who worked from the shadows, Gotti embraced the spotlight. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where crowds would gather just to catch a glimpse of him. He threw lavish neighborhood parties, gave to local charities, and cultivated an image as a man of the people. Unlike many of his predecessors who preferred to remain in the shadows, Gotti basked in the spotlight. He was the first tabloid don. Daily newspapers constantly ran stories on him and gave him his Teflon Don and Dapper Don nicknames. The media couldn't get enough of him. Here was a real-life gangster who looked like a movie star, who wasn't afraid to smile for the cameras, who seemed to thumb his nose at law enforcement with impunity. And for a while, it seemed like nothing could touch him. In the face of previous Mafia convictions, particularly the success of the Mafia Commission trial, Gotti's acquittal was a major upset that further added to his reputation. The American media dubbed him the Teflon Don, in reference to the failure of any charges to stick. Through methods that prosecutors would later prove included jury tampering and witness intimidation, Gotti was able to beat federal charges and trials in the 1980s for assault and racketeering, earning him the Teflon Don label from the media. The title wasn't really indicative of Gotti's legal history. He had served 3 years in a federal prison for theft and truck hijackings in 1968, and had been in and out of state prison since he was a teenager. But the spotlight that Gotti craved would ultimately be his downfall. Every appearance on the evening news, every photo in the tabloids, every acquittal that made headlines, they all served to focus the FBI's attention on him like a laser. Our New York agents and their colleagues in the New York Police Department, though, refused to give up. With extensive court-authorized electronic surveillance, diligent detective work, and the eventual cooperation of Gotti's henchman, Sammy the Bull Gravano, the Bureau and the NYPD built a strong case against him. The FBI had learned from their previous failures. They planted bugs everywhere, in Gotti's social clubs, in the apartments above them, even in the parking meters outside. They recorded thousands of hours of conversations, slowly building a case that would be impossible to beat. But the real blow came from within. Gotti's underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, aided the FBI in convicting Gotti. In 1991, Gravano agreed to turn state's evidence and testify against Gotti after hearing the boss make disparaging remarks about him on a wiretap that implicated them both in several murders. Gravano, who had killed 19 men for the family, decided that his loyalty had limits when he heard Gotti on tape, seemingly setting him up to take the fall. Worse yet, Gotti was heard on the tapes criticizing Gravano, who was disillusioned by his experience working for his boss. Gravano switched sides, and in the federal trial testified that Gotti led the Gambino family and ordered the murders. On April 2, 1992, after only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gotti guilty on all charges of the indictment. Locascio was found guilty on all but one. James Fox, assistant director in charge of the FBI's New York field office, announced at a press conference, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro, and all the charges stuck." On June 23, 1992, Glasser sentenced both defendants to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. and fined them both $250,000 each. Gotti was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. He spent the majority of his sentence in effective solitary confinement, allowed out of his cell for only 1 hour a day. The man who had craved the spotlight now lived in a concrete box, cut off from the world he had once ruled. He died in prison in June 2002. In 1998, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He died in 2002 at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. But the story of the Gambino family didn't end with John Gotti. In many ways, his downfall marked a return to the old ways, to the shadows, to the silence, to the understanding that in this life, invisibility is the greatest weapon. Following the Gotti regime, the control of the Gambino family was assumed by the organization's Sicilian faction. Beginning in 2015, the family was headed by Frank Cali until his assassination outside his Staten Island home on March 13, 2019. The family had learned its lesson. No more dapper dons, no more media darlings. Just quiet men in quiet rooms, making quiet fortunes. Even today, the family continues. Despite the decades of bloodshed, the Gambino crime family continues to operate to this day. They may not have the power they once did, when they could shut down construction sites with a phone call or control entire industries, but they adapt, they survive, they endure. Though the families once wielded far-reaching control within New York City, their influence and membership have been buffeted since the 1980s by corporate takeovers and prosecutions, according to experts. But the alleged involvement of several families in the gambling scheme could be a sign of their ongoing power. The construction industry they once dominated has been largely cleaned up. They've lost a lot of the construction industry, the development projects. There was a time when they built the Jacob Javits Center, he says, referencing construction unions the Mafia oversaw. The unions they controlled have been placed under federal supervision. Many of their traditional rackets have been taken over by other groups, or simply became obsolete in the digital age. But recent indictments tell us they're still there, still operating, still finding new ways to make money. 10 members of the Gambino crime family in Brooklyn were arrested and charged with a plethora of crimes, including racketeering, extortion, witness retaliation, in their alleged efforts to control New York's carting and demolition industries. The truth is, organized crime is like water. It finds the cracks, it adapts to its container, it flows around obstacles. The Gambino family has survived for over a century not through brute force alone, but through an ability to change with the times while maintaining their core structure. In court papers, prosecutors charged that the Gambino family is thriving, earning millions of dollars through various forms of fraud, bribery, money laundering, and extortion, particularly in the construction industry. Even now in 2023, federal prosecutors were still uncovering schemes where the family was infiltrating major construction projects, including luxury developments along the High Line in Manhattan. This is the paradox of the Gambino crime family. They are at once a relic of the past and a very present danger. They are weakened but not defeated. They are pursued but not caught. They are known but still mysterious. Think about what this family has witnessed and survived. They've seen New York transform from a city of tenements and pushcarts to one of glass towers and tech startups. They've survived Prohibition and the Depression, World War II and the Cold War, the crack epidemic and 9/11. They've outlasted mayors and governors, police commissioners and FBI directors. Administrations come and go, but the family endures. The Gambino crime family, pronounced Gambino, is an Italian-American mafia crime family, and one of the 5 families that dominate organized crime activities in New York City, within the nationwide criminal phenomenon known as the American Mafia. The group, which went through 5 bosses between 1910 and 1957, is named after Carlo Gambino, boss of the family at the time of the McClellan hearings in 1963, when the structure of organized crime first gained public attention. The group's operations extend from New York and the eastern seaboard to California. Its illicit activities include labor and construction racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, extortion, money laundering, prostitution, fraud, hijacking, and fencing. What's perhaps most chilling about the Gambino story isn't the violence or the corruption. It's the banality of it all. For decades, they operated in plain sight. They had offices. They paid taxes sometimes. Their kids went to school with your kids. They shopped at the same stores, ate at the same restaurants, lived in the same neighborhoods. They weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were the shadows themselves, cast by the everyday business of New York City. Every time you walked past a construction site in New York, chances are the Gambinos were getting paid. Every time you threw out your garbage, they might have controlled the company that picked it up. When you bought clothes in the garment district or flew out of JFK Airport, you were moving through their invisible empire. They didn't control New York through fear alone. They made themselves essential to its operation. The most successful parasites are the ones you never notice, the ones that become so integrated into the system that removing them seems impossible. For decades, that was the Gambino family. They weren't just criminals operating outside the law. They had woven themselves into the fabric of New York City so thoroughly that they became part of its DNA, and perhaps that's the most important lesson from their story. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures and violent acts. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie. Sometimes it shakes your hand and smiles. Sometimes it operates not from the shadows, but from glass offices in broad daylight. The Gambino family understood this better than anyone. They controlled New York City not through overwhelming force, but through 1,000 small corruptions, each one seeming insignificant on its own. A bribed inspector here, a union official in their pocket there, a construction company that knew to use the right concrete supplier, a garbage route that went to the right bidder. Death by 1,000 cuts, except the city didn't even know it was bleeding. Looking back at their century-long history, you see patterns that repeat like a broken record. The young, ambitious soldier who takes out the old boss. The quiet consolidation of power. The gradual expansion into legitimate business. The inevitable overreach. The fall. And then, like clockwork, the cycle begins again with a new face, but the same old song. From Salvatore d'Aquila to Frank Cali, from the tenements of East Harlem to the boardrooms of Manhattan, the Gambino family story is really the story of American power itself. How it's gained, how it's wielded, how it corrupts, and how it endures. They showed us that in America, crime could be organized like a corporation, that murder could be just another business expense, that entire cities could be held hostage by men who never fired a gun themselves. But there's something else in this story, something that speaks to a deeper truth about human nature and society. The Gambino family could never have gained the power they did without the complicity of thousands of ordinary people. The cops who looked the other way, the judges who took bribes, the union officials who sold out their members, the businessmen who paid rather than fought, the politicians who took campaign contributions and asked no questions. In the end, the Gambino crime family didn't control New York City because they were more violent or more clever than everyone else. They controlled it because on some level the city let them. Because it was easier to pay than to fight. Because everyone had a price. Because the system itself was corruptible. Surprisingly enough, though, the killing wasn't mob-related. As it turned out, Cali was killed by a QAnon conspiracy theorist who allegedly believed he was a deep state figure. Even Frank Cali's death in 2019 speaks to how the world has changed. He wasn't killed by a rival family or an ambitious underling, but by a delusional conspiracy theorist. It's almost symbolic. The old world of organized crime colliding with the new world of disorganized madness. Today, when you walk through New York City, you're walking through invisible history. That construction site might once have paid the Gambino tax. That restaurant might once have been a mob hangout. That ordinary-looking social club might have been where murders were planned and empires were built. The city is haunted by its criminal past, even as it rushes toward its gleaming future. But don't think this story is just history. Don't think it's safely in the past. The federal gambling indictments indicate the New York Mafia may be more powerful than experts previously believed. As long as there's money to be made, as long as there are systems to corrupt, as long as there are people willing to look the other way, there will be organizations like the Gambino crime family. They may not control the concrete industry anymore. They may not be able to shut down construction sites with a phone call, but they're still out there, adapted to the 21st century, finding new rackets, new schemes, new ways to insert themselves into the flow of money and power. Because that's what survivors do. They adapt, they endure, they wait for their moment. The Gambino crime family's greatest trick wasn't controlling New York's underworld, it was convincing New Yorkers that they were just a colorful part of the city's culture, just another thread in the rich tapestry of urban life. They turned murder into mythology, crime into culture, evil into entertainment. They became part of the city's story, and in doing so, they ensured their own immortality. Every time someone watches a mob movie, reads a crime novel, or tours a former mob hangout, the legend grows. Every time someone jokes about sleeping with the fishes or making an offer you can't refuse, they're keeping the myth alive. The Gambino family understood something fundamental about power. It's not just about what you control, but about what people believe you control. And so their story continues, written not just in blood and bullets, but in the collective memory of a city that both feared and was fascinated by them. They showed us the dark side of the American dream, where success could be measured in bodies as easily as dollars, where family loyalty meant conspiracy to commit murder, where business was conducted with bullets as often as briefcases. In the end, the story of the Gambino crime family is a mirror held up to American society. It shows us our fascination with outlaws, our admiration for those who beat the system, our willingness to compromise our principles for comfort or profit. It shows us that sometimes the real gangsters wear suits and work in offices, that corruption can be as American as apple pie, that every society gets the criminals it deserves. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that evil is not some abstract concept or distant threat. It's the neighbor who looks the other way. It's the official who takes the bribe. It's the businessman who pays protection rather than going to the police. It's the thousand small compromises that add up to one big corruption. It's the silence that lets injustice flourish. The Gambino crime family controlled New York City for decades, not because they were invincible, but because too many people believed they were. They ruled through perception as much as power, through reputation as much as violence. They understood that in the end, all power is an illusion, but it's an illusion that can shape reality if enough people believe in it. As you finish hearing this story, as you go back to your daily life, remember this. The Gambino family may be weakened. Their leaders may be dead or in prison. Their empire may be a shadow of what it once was. But the conditions that created them, poverty, corruption, the human capacity for violence and greed, these things remain. Somewhere in New York City tonight, in some neighborhood you've never heard of, young men are making the same choices that Salvatore d'Aquila made over a century ago. They're choosing the gun over the book, the streets over the classroom, the fast money over the honest dollar. They're writing the next chapter in a story that never really ends. The names change. The faces change. The rackets evolve with the times. But the game remains the same. Power, money, respect, fear. These are the currencies that never go out of style. The Gambino crime family may have controlled New York City without most people knowing, but now you know. Now you've seen behind the curtain. Now you understand that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who convince you they're just businessmen. And maybe, just maybe, knowing their story helps us recognize the patterns when they emerge again. Maybe understanding how one family could control an entire city helps us prevent it from happening again. Or maybe it just reminds us that in every society and every generation, there will always be those who choose to take what they want rather than earn it, who see law as weakness and violence as strength, who build empires on the suffering of others. The Gambino crime family's century-long reign over New York City has ended, but their legacy lives on in the movies we watch, the stories we tell, and the lessons we've learned about power, corruption, and the price of looking the other way. They controlled a city without most people knowing, but now their secret is out. Now their story has been told, and now perhaps we can finally see them for what they really were. Not romantic anti-heroes or colorful characters, but parasites feeding on the body of a great city. Criminals who turned suffering into profit. Men who chose evil and called it business. Their empire has crumbled. Their power has faded. But the scars they left on New York City remain. Every family destroyed by their drugs. Every business ruined by their extortion. Every life cut short by their violence. These are their true monuments. Not the headlines or the movies or the legends, but the very real pain they caused to very real people. Remember them not as kings of the underworld, but as what they really were. Criminals who got away with it for far too long. Remember them as a warning, not a celebration. Remember them so we can recognize their successors before they gain the same power. The Gambino crime family controlled New York City without most people knowing. But now you know. And knowledge, unlike concrete or garbage routes or union votes, is one thing they could never control. It's the one thing that, in the end, might just be stronger than all their guns and all their money and all their power. Because in the light of truth, shadows disappear. And the Gambino crime family, for all their power, were ultimately nothing more than shadows. Dark, grasping shadows that held a great city hostage for far too long. But shadows nonetheless, and like all shadows, they vanished when someone finally had the courage to turn on the light.